It wasn't the absence of love that had weighed on me all these years. It was its hollow presence, a fragile shell that Gregory and I had learned to hold in place through carefully chosen words, routine gestures, and practiced smiles. Like many couples, we knew how to move in synchronized silence, each of us wrapped in our own carefully crafted narratives. But something happens when the silence stretches too long, when the cracks in the shell spread just enough to make you question the strength of the whole. I never imagined that a retreat in the misty, secluded mountains of Montana, meant to rekindle our bond, would be the beginning of something that would shatter the delicate surface of our lives. Nor did I foresee the proposition Gregory would place before me one quiet evening as the mountains stretched dark and silent outside our cabin window. A proposition that made me question everything I had believed about love, fidelity, and strangest of all, the man I'd spent nearly 4 decades beside. But that's how it began, with a question I never thought he'd ask, and an answer I wasn't sure I'd ever be able to give. The mountains were a blur outside the window of our private jet, an endless stretch of jagged earth and dense pine that seemed both breathtaking and, at that moment, slightly foreboding. Gregory sat across from me, lost in his phone, his face bathed in the soft blue light of the screen. I studied him for a moment, the familiar sharp angles of his face, the lines deepening around his mouth. Once, I'd loved every detail of that face. Now, it felt like a mask, unmoving and detached, as though the man I'd married had retreated somewhere far beyond my reach. It was a well-practiced distance. Gregory's presence, a faint echo across our vast, well-appointed life, had become something I'd learned to accept long ago. It had started subtly, in missed phone calls and absent conversations, but as the years wore on, I began to realize there was a chasm growing between us, a gulf so wide that even when we were together, I felt alone. When he suggested this retreat, a part of me was hopeful. Maybe this would be the moment we'd reconnect. Maybe here, far from the demands of his world, he'd see me again. But as the weekend progressed, the hope slowly faded. At the first bonding exercise, Gregory's irritation was palpable. We sat in a room with a dozen other couples, a therapist guiding us through a series of questions meant to reveal our inner thoughts. I watched as couples leaned into one another, whispering, laughing, their hands interlaced in small, intimate gestures. When it was our turn, Gregory answered each question with clinical precision, his responses perfunctory, calculated. It was as though he were sitting through a board meeting, not a deeply personal exchange with his wife of 38 years. When our score came back, the lowest of all couples in the retreat, I could feel a quiet shame settling over me. I avoided Gregory's gaze, feeling as though I'd been exposed, the hollow truth of our marriage laid bare. Later that evening, back in our cabin, we ate dinner in near silence. I forced myself to look up from my plate. Did it bother you? The score, I mean. He shrugged, cutting his steak with a careful, steady hand. It's just an exercise, Elena. I wouldn't take it personally. Of course he wouldn't. Gregory was a man of facts, of logic and reason. Emotional exercises had always been beneath him, a nuisance that he endured only when absolutely necessary. But then, after a pause, he looked at me with an odd glint in his eye. Do you think we'd score higher with someone else? The question hung between us, strange and unsettling. What do you mean? He set down his fork, folding his hands. If the purpose of this retreat is to make us confront the state of our relationship, why don't we try a different approach? I stared at him, the absurdity of his suggestions seeping into my mind. What kind of approach? And that's when he said it. I've been talking to Martin lately. You know, about his wife, Rachel. He's told me how unhappy she is, how they've grown apart. His eyes searched mine. Maybe if we each spent time with someone who understands that distance, that kind of loneliness, it might give us a new perspective. The silence that followed was vast and unbreakable. I couldn't tell if I was shocked, appalled, or strangely intrigued. My mind raced with 100 questions, none of which I dared voice aloud. It felt like we were crossing into forbidden territory, stepping over a line that, once crossed, could never be redrawn. But Gregory, in his calm, steady way, simply waited for my response, his gaze unwavering. I felt the weight of his words settling over me, each one an anchor pulling me deeper into a place I'd never thought I'd go. Gregory and I had crossed lines before, the unspoken kind. The kind that let us lead separate lives within our marriage. The tacit boundaries that let us pretend everything was fine as long as no one looked too closely. But this was a bold, unmistakable line. One that could never be undone. "I don't understand," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "You want us to experiment?" Gregory nodded, his face expressionless. "Think of it as an exercise, like this retreat. It's about seeing ourselves through a different lens. You'd spend time with Martin, and I'd do the same with Rachel, just for a short period. See what we discover about ourselves." I stared at him, searching his face for any hint of mischief, some flicker that might reveal this was all a game. But there was nothing. Just the same stoic calm that had drawn me to him all those years ago, the kind of calm that now made him feel miles away, unreachable. "Martin and Rachel? Do they know about this idea?" My question came out sharper than I intended, my voice trembling with a strange, quiet fear. "They do," he said, meeting my gaze. "We discussed it. They're open to it. And they're curious." The thought of Martin Riley, a close family friend, someone I'd known for years, suddenly occupying this strange new role in my life felt surreal. He was handsome in a soft, disarming way, a historian and novelist with a knack for storytelling that I'd always admired. But that admiration was distant, abstract. I had never looked at him in any other light. And yet there was a whisper of intrigue beneath my shock, a glimmer of something I hadn't felt in years, a quiet thrill. "I don't know, Gregory. This feels unthinkable." But even as I said the words, I couldn't help the way my mind wandered to the possibility of something beyond the routine, the empty spaces Gregory had left unfilled. He leaned back, hands clasped in his lap. "I'm not suggesting this to hurt you, Elena. This is about honesty, facing the truth of where we are without hiding behind convention." The words settled uncomfortably in the air between us. Honesty. It was an ironic choice, coming from a man who had spent the better part of his life concealing his emotions behind the polished veneer of success. That night, I lay in bed beside him, staring at the ceiling. Every part of me wanted to reject the idea, to pretend this conversation had never happened. And yet, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered something different. What if I awoke the next morning with the unsettling realization that I had agreed to the unthinkable? Gregory's proposition lingered in my mind, its sharp edges both thrilling and terrifying. But I'd nodded my head the night before, a silent acceptance that now felt both impulsive and inevitable. That evening, Gregory arranged for a private dinner at the cabin with Martin and Rachel. It was a calculated move on his part, designed to test the waters, to ease us into this precarious arrangement. When the doorbell rang, I felt my stomach twist, a sudden flood of nerves I hadn't felt in years. Martin entered first, his presence filling the room with a warmth that was in stark contrast to Gregory's practiced reserve. He greeted me with a gentle smile, his eyes studying mine with a mix of curiosity and something else. Something unreadable but distinctly intense. I had always known Martin as a storyteller, a man of depth and subtlety. Someone who could listen for hours and make you feel like the most interesting person in the world. Tonight, though, there was something different about him. The usual air of detachment was gone, replaced by a quiet intensity that made me feel strangely vulnerable. "Hello, Elena," he said, his voice soft. "Gregory told me about the retreat." "Did he?" I managed, glancing at Gregory, who was observing us with an almost clinical interest. Martin nodded, his gaze steady. He mentioned the experiment. Rachel entered a moment later, moving with a grace that I envied. She was younger than me by a few years, but there was a poise about her that made her seem timeless, unshakable. Unlike Martin, she offered no easy warmth, no comforting smile. Instead, she studied me with a measured, enigmatic look, as if she were sizing me up, weighing me against her own silent criteria. We settled into an uneasy dinner, the four of us moving around each other like strangers in a strange new world. Gregory dominated the conversation at first, steering it toward neutral topics, discussing business ventures and mutual acquaintances. But there was an underlying tension that none of us could ignore, a weight that pressed down on each word, each glance. Finally, Martin turned to me, breaking the silence. "So, Elena," he said, his voice low, almost conspiratorial, "what do you hope to find in this arrangement?" His question caught me off guard, and I felt the heat rise to my cheeks. I'm not sure yet," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I suppose I'm just curious." A small smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Curiosity can be dangerous," he murmured, his gaze lingering on me for a moment longer than necessary. "But it's often the beginning of something important." Across the table, I felt Gregory's eyes on me, watching my every reaction. I couldn't read his expression, whether it was approval, jealousy, or something else entirely. But there was a strange satisfaction in his gaze, as though he were witnessing a piece of his plan falling into place. After dinner, we moved to the lounge, settling into separate corners of the room. Gregory and Rachel engaged in quiet conversation, their heads bent together as they spoke in low voices. I tried to catch snippets of their exchange, but they were too far, their words lost in the soft hum of the fireplace. Martin sat beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his presence, the quiet, magnetic pull that made my heart race. "Are you nervous?" he asked, his voice so soft it was barely audible. I looked up, meeting his gaze. "A little," I admitted. "I've never done anything like this before." "Neither have I," he said, his expression thoughtful. "But there's something about you, that makes me want to try." The air between us grew thick with unspoken tension, each of us caught in the pull of something we couldn't name. It was as if a barrier had been lifted, one that had held us apart for years, allowing us to see each other clearly for the first time. He reached out, his hand brushing against mine, and I felt a spark, a brief, electric shock that jolted me back to life. In that moment, the boundaries of our marriage, our identities, our lives seemed to blur, leaving only the two of us in the quiet, trembling silence. Before I could respond, Gregory's voice cut through the air, pulling us back into reality. "Shall we call it a night?" he asked, his tone casual but his gaze sharp. I felt a pang of disappointment, a strange ache that I couldn't fully understand. Martin released my hand, his expression unreadable, and I felt the loss of his touch like a cold void. We rose, exchanging polite goodnights, but the tension lingered, an unspoken promise that hung between us like a secret. As Gregory and I returned to our suite, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted irrevocably, that we had crossed a line that could never be redrawn. And yet, despite the fear, despite the doubt, I felt a spark of something new, something that had lain dormant for far too long. That night, as I lay beside Gregory in the dark, I found myself unable to sleep, my mind racing with 1,000 possibilities. For the first time in years, I felt alive, as though a door had opened in my life, leading to a world I had never dared to explore. And in that moment, I knew I was ready to step through it, no matter what lay on the other side. The next day felt like the start of a journey I couldn't turn away from, even if I tried. Gregory and I kept up the appearance of normalcy, sharing polite conversation over breakfast, discussing the day's plans, as though nothing unusual had occurred. But beneath the surface, there was a current of tension, an unspoken understanding that lingered in every glance, every word. Martin had invited me to meet him at a nearby gallery, a quiet, understated place that showcased local artists. He'd called it a neutral ground, a place where we could talk without the expectations or constraints of our shared social circles. As I entered the gallery, I felt a flutter of nerves, a feeling both exhilarating and terrifying. I spotted Martin near a painting, his attention focused on the canvas, his expression thoughtful. There was a calmness about him that put me at ease, a steady, grounding presence that made everything else fade away. "Elena," he said, turning to me with a smile, "I'm glad you came." His voice was warm, inviting, and I felt myself relax, the tension slipping from my shoulders as we began to wander through the gallery, stopping to admire the paintings, sharing quiet observations and easy laughter. For the first time in years, I felt seen, heard, valued for more than the role I played in someone else's life. And with each passing moment, I found myself drawn deeper into his world, into the possibility of something more, something real. We wandered the gallery, moving between exhibits with an unspoken rhythm, each piece of art sparking quiet exchanges that left lingering pauses and thoughtful silences. I found myself opening up to Martin, sharing thoughts I hadn't dared to voice aloud in years. He listened, never interrupting, his eyes meeting mine with a steady attentiveness that felt both comforting and thrilling. When we paused in front of a small, strikingly minimalist painting, Martin turned to me, his gaze thoughtful. "Tell me, Elena, what do you really want from this?" His question lingered in the air between us, a thin line daring me to step over it. I hesitated, my mind racing, but I couldn't avoid the truth. Not here, not with him. "I don't know yet," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I know that I can't keep going like this, feeling invisible." Martin's expression softened, and he reached out, his hand resting gently on my arm. "I understand," he said simply. "Sometimes we find ourselves living in a shadow, becoming what's expected of us without realizing we've lost ourselves along the way." His words struck a chord deep within me, reverberating through the parts of myself I had buried beneath the weight of expectation and duty. "It's strange," I said, my voice trembling. "I feel like I'm rediscovering something I thought I'd lost forever. And yet, I'm terrified." Martin's hand remained steady on my arm, his touch warm and grounding. "It's okay to be afraid, Elena. Sometimes fear is just a sign that we're stepping into something important, something that matters." I glanced at him, feeling the weight of his words settle over me, a quiet reassurance that made my heart beat just a little faster. There was something in his gaze, a glimmer of understanding, that felt as though he could see through all the layers of my life, past the carefully crafted facades and down to the raw, vulnerable core of who I was. We left the gallery a short while later, the sun dipping low over the mountains as we walked back toward the cabin in silence. The air was crisp, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and earth, a grounding presence that contrasted the storm of emotions swirling inside me. When we reached the cabin, Martin paused, turning to me with a soft smile. "Thank you, Elena," he said quietly, "for today, for sharing a part of yourself with me." His words held a weight I couldn't ignore, a quiet, unspoken promise that left me feeling both exhilarated and uncertain. I managed a small smile, my heart pounding in my chest as I watched him disappear into the shadows, leaving me alone with my thoughts. When I returned to the cabin, I found Gregory in his study, his face illuminated by the glow of his computer screen. He glanced up as I entered, his gaze sharp and appraising, as though he were trying to read the effect of my day with Martin on my face. There was a tension in the room, a charged silence that neither of us dared to break. Finally, he leaned back, folding his hands over his lap. "So, how was your day?" His tone was casual, but there was an edge to it. A faint hint of something that felt almost like jealousy, or perhaps something darker. I hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "It was nice," I replied, careful to keep my voice even. We talked, that's all. Gregory nodded, his expression unreadable. I hope you're finding this experience valuable, he said, his voice low. I thought it might help us both see things more clearly. I couldn't help but feel a flicker of irritation at his choice of words. Valuable, as though our marriage was nothing more than an investment in need of a return. But I swallowed the comment, feeling the weight of his gaze pressing down on me. And you? I asked, forcing myself to meet his eyes. Have you found any clarity? He paused, his gaze shifting toward the window, where the last traces of daylight were beginning to fade. Rachel has a way of grounding me, he said slowly. She's different from you, Elena. Quiet, introspective, but she understands things that I've never taken the time to consider. A chill ran through me at his words, an unspoken truth settling over us. We were both stepping into a world that neither of us fully understood. A place where boundaries blurred and the familiar became foreign. And yet, I felt a strange exhilaration, a sense of freedom I hadn't felt in years. As the days passed, Martin and I continued to spend time together, our conversations growing deeper, our silences more comfortable. He became a mirror through which I began to see myself more clearly, not as Gregory's wife, but as a person in my own right, a woman with thoughts, desires, and dreams that had been silenced for far too long. One evening, as the autumn leaves fell in a gentle cascade outside the cabin window, Martin and I found ourselves sitting together on the porch, watching the stars emerge one by one in the deepening twilight. There was a stillness between us, a sense of anticipation that neither of us dared to acknowledge. Elena, he said softly, his voice carrying a weight that made my heart skip a beat. Have you ever thought about what life would be like if things were different? I glanced at him, feeling the depth of his question settle over me like a soft, unsettling fog. I don't know, I replied honestly. For so long, I thought I knew what my life would look like. But now, everything feels uncertain. Martin nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. Uncertainty isn't always a bad thing, he murmured, his hand reaching out to brush against mine. Sometimes, it's the only way to find out who we really are. His touch lingered, a soft, subtle warmth that sent a shiver down my spine. There was an intimacy in that moment, a quiet understanding that felt deeper than words. I felt myself leaning into him, my defenses crumbling under the weight of his gaze. Just as I was about to respond, I heard a soft rustling behind us, and turned to see Gregory standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. The tension in the air was palpable, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken boundary we had just crossed. Gregory stepped forward, his gaze shifting between us. I see you two have been enjoying each other's company, he said, his voice carefully measured. There was a hint of something in his tone. Possessiveness, perhaps, or jealousy. That surprised me. Yes, I replied, my voice is steady. We have. Gregory's gaze lingered on me for a moment before he turned to Martin, his expression hardening. I trust you'll remember the nature of our arrangement, he said quietly, his voice carrying a subtle warning. Martin met his gaze evenly, a flicker of defiance in his eyes. I haven't forgotten, he replied, his voice calm. But sometimes arrangements don't always go as planned. Gregory's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. Be careful, Martin, he murmured, his tone laced with an edge that sent a chill down my spine. Some things are better left untouched. Martin held his ground, his expression unyielding. Perhaps, he said softly, but sometimes it's the things we're most afraid to touch that end up changing us the most. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with unspoken words and hidden meanings. I could feel the tension between them, a quiet battle of wills that left me feeling both exhilarated and deeply unsettled. As Gregory turned and disappeared into the cabin, I felt a sense of dread settle over me, a realization that we had crossed into dangerous territory, a place where nothing would ever be the same. And yet, despite the fear, I felt a spark of defiance, a desire to reclaim the parts of myself I had long forgotten the pieces I had buried beneath the weight of a life lived in someone else's shadow. Over the following days, a subtle but undeniable shift took place. Gregory grew distant, his mood darkening, a sense of possessiveness emerging in ways I hadn't seen in years. There were quiet conversations with Rachel, whispers exchanged late at night, and moments where I caught him watching me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. One evening, I overheard a fragment of their conversation, the words slipping through the walls like a dark secret. "She needs to remember where her loyalty lies," Gregory murmured, his voice cold and unyielding. Rachel's voice was softer, almost soothing. "Give her time, Gregory. She's been lost for so long. This is new for her." Their words unsettled me, stirring something deep within me, a sense of rebellion, a desire to break free from the life that had held me captive for so many years. I realized then that this arrangement, this experiment, had set something in motion that none of us could control. It wasn't just a question of loyalty or love. It was a battle for self-discovery, a journey toward reclaiming the pieces of ourselves that had been lost along the way. And as I lay awake that night, the weight of my choices pressing down on me, I knew that the only way forward was to embrace the uncertainty, to let the walls come down and to find out who I truly was, even if it meant stepping into the unknown. The following days turned our cabin into a battlefield of glances, small gestures, and heavy silences. Gregory's presence was no longer cool and indifferent. It was guarded, almost wary. He began watching me as though trying to read my thoughts, searching for signs of betrayal in the subtle gestures and glances I shared with Martin. It was as if he had willingly opened a door, yet felt unprepared for what lay beyond. Rachel, too, seemed to sense the tension. Her calm facade began to waver as she noticed Gregory's change in demeanor. She seemed to cling to him more closely, pulling him into hushed conversations by the fireplace, her gaze flickering toward me with a look that was almost calculating. I hadn't anticipated this side of her, this quiet intensity that contrasted with the soft-spoken, observant woman I had known. One evening, as Martin and I prepared to head out for a walk, Rachel pulled me aside in the hallway, her voice barely above a whisper. "Elena," she began, her hand brushing lightly over my arm. "Can we talk?" I nodded, my stomach tightening at the serious look in her eyes. She led me into the small, dimly lit library, the smell of old leather and polished wood enveloping us. Rachel shut the door quietly behind us, her expression cautious, guarded. "Elena," she said softly, "I can see that things between you and Martin are growing closer." She paused, her fingers tracing the spine of a book on the shelf. "I just wanted to remind you of the nature of this arrangement. There's a lot at stake here. Gregory is a powerful man, and he doesn't like surprises." Her words hung heavy in the air, a warning wrapped in subtle kindness. I felt my heart pound in my chest, a cold shiver running down my spine. This arrangement, this delicate balancing act, was beginning to crack under the strain. I realized that, for all her gentleness, Rachel had her own agenda, her own quiet need to keep control over the situation. I forced a small smile, nodding. "Thank you, Rachel. I understand." But even as I said the words, I knew there was no turning back. That evening, as we gathered in the lounge, the tension in the room was palpable. Gregory's gaze was sharp and piercing, lingering on Martin and me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. Rachel sat close to him, her hand resting on his arm, as if to anchor him, her expression distant and thoughtful. When the conversation turned to the topic of secrets, Martin spoke up, his voice calm but pointed. "It's funny, isn't it, how we can think we know someone so well, yet find that they're capable of things we never imagined." His words struck a nerve, and I caught Gregory's jaw tightening, his fingers drumming against the arm of his chair. "Secrets can destroy people," Gregory replied, his tone laced with something darker, something cold and unyielding, especially when they're hidden by the ones closest to us. The air grew heavy, the underlying tension in his words sending a chill through me. I glanced at Martin, who met my gaze with a look of quiet determination, as though he were standing his ground against an unseen enemy. In that moment, I realized that this arrangement was no longer a simple experiment. It had become a battleground, a place where loyalties, desires, and betrayals simmered beneath the surface. As the evening wore on, I found myself alone with Martin by the fireplace, the warmth of the flames casting a soft glow over his face. He looked at me, his eyes filled with an intensity that made my heart race, the distance between us seeming to disappear in that quiet, fragile moment. "Elena," he murmured, his voice low and steady, "I don't want you to feel trapped. If this arrangement no longer feels right for you." I reached out, placing a hand over his, silencing his words. "It's not that simple, Martin," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. "There's a part of me that's terrified, but there's another part that feels alive in a way I haven't felt in years." Martin's gaze softened, his fingers brushing gently over mine. "Then let's face that fear together," he said quietly, his voice filled with a quiet resolve. And in that moment, I knew that no matter what happened, I couldn't turn back. Not from him, not from the possibility of a life I had never dared to dream of. The following day, the fragile calm that had settled over us shattered in an instant. I was walking back from the garden when I saw Gregory and Martin standing near the porch, their voices low and tense. Gregory's face was flushed, his eyes narrowed with anger, while Martin's stance was firm, unyielding. As I approached, their voices became clearer, the anger simmering beneath Gregory's calm facade finally breaking through. "Don't mistake her kindness for weakness, Martin," Gregory was saying, his tone filled with a cold, quiet fury. "You think you can just walk into our lives and disrupt everything we've built?" Martin didn't flinch, his gaze steady. "Maybe it's time to question what you've built, Gregory. Perhaps Elena deserves something more than half-hearted gestures and empty promises." Gregory's face darkened, his fists clenching at his sides. "You have no idea what you're talking about. You think this is some kind of romantic escape? It's not. This is my life, my marriage, and I won't let you ruin it with your idealistic nonsense." I stepped forward, unable to listen any longer. "Stop," I said, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. "Both of you stop. This isn't about who's right or wrong. It's about choices. Choices we all made together." Gregory turned to me, his expression softening for a brief moment before hardening again. "And what about your choice, Elena?" he asked quietly. "Are you really willing to throw everything away for this?" I felt a surge of anger rise within me, a fire that had been smoldering for far too long. "Maybe the life we built isn't what I want anymore, Gregory. Maybe I need something real, something that feels alive." My words hit him like a blow, and for the first time I saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes, a glimmer of fear, of loss. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, he turned and walked away, leaving Martin and me standing alone in the fading light, the weight of my words settling over us like a dark, unspoken promise. The days that followed were filled with a tense, uneasy silence. Gregory and I barely spoke, each of us retreating into our own separate worlds, the chasm between us growing wider with each passing day. Rachel seemed equally distant, her demeanor cool and controlled, as though she were watching a story unfold from afar, observing rather than participating. One evening I found myself alone in the study, staring at a painting on the wall, a quiet landscape, filled with soft, muted colors. It was a piece I had chosen years ago, one that had once brought me comfort, but now, as I looked at it, I felt only emptiness. A hollow ache that reminded me of all the years I had spent trying to fill a void I hadn't fully understood. Martin entered the room quietly, his presence a soothing balm against the silence. He approached slowly, his gaze fixed on the painting before he turned to me, his expression thoughtful. "Elena," he murmured, his voice soft, You don't have to live like this, not anymore. His words echoed in the quiet room, a gentle promise that made my heart ache with longing. I turned to him, feeling the weight of my choices pressing down on me, the realization that I was standing on the edge of something vast and unknown. And in that moment, I knew that I couldn't stay here. Not in this life. Not in this hollow marriage that had become a prison. I needed freedom, a chance to reclaim the parts of myself that had been lost, to discover who I truly was without the weight of someone else's expectations. With a steady breath, I reached out, taking Martin's hand in mine. Together we stood in the silence, each of us understanding that this was just the beginning, that the journey ahead would be filled with challenges, but also with the promise of something real, something worth fighting for. The final confrontation came 2 days later, in the quiet of the early morning. Gregory had gone for a walk, his presence heavy with the knowledge that something was ending, something beyond his control. I found him by the edge of the lake, his gaze fixed on the still water, his expression filled with a sadness I hadn't seen before. As I approached, he turned to me, his face unreadable. "So this is it?" he asked quietly, his voice filled with a quiet resignation. I nodded, feeling a pang of sadness, a sense of loss for the life we had shared, the years we had spent together. "Yes, Gregory, I think it is." He looked away, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I never wanted this, Elena. I thought I could give you everything you needed. I thought I could make you happy." I reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I know, Gregory. And you did once. But people change. We can't keep pretending that things are the same, that we're the same." He nodded slowly, his gaze drifting back to the lake. "So what happens now?" I took a deep breath, the weight of my decision settling over me. "I don't know," I replied honestly, "but I think it's time for both of us to find out." And with those words, I turned and walked away, the dawn breaking over the horizon, a new beginning waiting just beyond the edge of the lake. Walking away from Gregory that morning felt surreal, as though I were crossing into a world I'd only dreamed of. A place where I no longer had to conform to the quiet, predictable existence I had been living. But that freedom was accompanied by a gnawing fear, a whisper in my mind that asked, "What now?" When I returned to the cabin, Martin was waiting for me. His expression softened as he saw me, and he stepped forward, his hand resting on my shoulder. "You did it, didn't you?" he murmured, his voice filled with both relief and concern. I nodded, barely able to speak. "It's over," I whispered. "At least, this part of it." He pulled me close, wrapping his arms around me in a silent reassurance, the warmth of his embrace chasing away the chill that had settled in my bones. For a moment, I allowed myself to breathe, to simply exist in his arms, without the weight of the past pressing down on me. But there was still a long road ahead. I couldn't ignore the fact that my entire life had been tied to Gregory, our home, our finances, even our friendships. Leaving him wasn't as simple as walking away. It meant unraveling the fabric of my own existence, facing a world that felt unfamiliar and uncertain. A few days later, I returned to the city with Martin. We had agreed to take things slowly, to give ourselves time to heal from the upheaval of the past few weeks. But even as we settled into our new reality, I felt the ghost of my old life hovering just behind me, a presence that refused to be forgotten. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a letter from Gregory's lawyer. He was filing for divorce, a move I had anticipated, but the details left me stunned. He wanted to keep nearly everything: our home, the investments we'd built together, even the art collection I had carefully curated over the years. It was as though he were determined to erase every trace of me from our life, to reclaim the pieces of himself he believed I had stolen. When I showed the letter to Martin, his face darkened, his jaw tightening. "He's trying to punish you," he said quietly. "He can't bear the idea of you moving on without him, so he's making it as difficult as possible." I sighed, feeling the weight of Gregory's betrayal settling over me. Part of me had hoped that we could part peacefully, that he would understand the need for us to go our separate ways. But I had underestimated the depth of his resentment, the way he would cling to control even in our separation. "It doesn't matter," I said finally, steeling myself. "I won't let him take everything. Not after everything I've given him." Martin nodded, his gaze steady. "You don't have to face this alone, Elena. Whatever happens, I'll be here." His words gave me strength, a reassurance that I wasn't facing this battle on my own. For the first time, I began to see a path forward, not as Gregory's wife, but as a woman reclaiming her life, her independence. The divorce proceedings were brutal, a drawn-out affair that left me feeling drained and exhausted. Gregory's lawyer was relentless, attacking every claim I made, challenging every detail of our life together. He wanted to paint me as the one who had strayed, who had broken the bonds of marriage through my connection with Martin. I sat through endless meetings, each one a reminder of the life I was leaving behind. But no matter how hard they tried to discredit me, I held firm, determined to keep the pieces of myself that Gregory couldn't take away. One evening, after a particularly grueling day in court, I returned home to find Martin waiting for me. He had prepared a simple dinner, a small gesture that brought tears to my eyes. He didn't ask about the court proceedings. He simply held me, offering a quiet comfort that I had never known before. "It won't be like this forever," he murmured, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "One day, you'll look back on this and realize how strong you were." His words resonated with me, a reminder that I was not just a wife or a possession to be discarded. I was a person in my own right, a woman fighting to reclaim her life. Over the following months, Martin and I grew closer, our bond deepening with each shared moment. He became more than a partner. He was a confidant, a friend, someone who saw me for who I truly was. And as the final days of the divorce proceedings drew near, I began to feel a sense of peace, a quiet acceptance of the life I was building. The day the divorce was finalized felt both like an ending and a beginning. Gregory and I sat across from each other in the small, impersonal office of the courthouse, each of us carefully avoiding the other's gaze. He looked older, his face lined with anger and bitterness, a shadow of the man I had once loved. As we signed the final papers, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, a sense of freedom that I hadn't felt in years. But there was also a pang of sadness, a quiet mourning for the life we had shared, the dreams we had once built together. When it was over, I stood up, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Goodbye, Gregory," I said softly, my voice filled with both regret and resolve. He looked at me, his gaze hard and unyielding. "Goodbye, Elena," he replied coldly, his voice devoid of warmth or affection. And with those words, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing alone in the empty courtroom. I took a deep breath, allowing myself a moment to feel the weight of my new reality. I was free, truly, finally free. But that freedom came with a cost, a quiet loneliness that lingered in the silence. In the weeks that followed, I began to rebuild my life, piece by piece. Martin was by my side through every step, offering support and encouragement as I navigated the unfamiliar world of independence. We moved into a small, cozy apartment together, a space that felt uniquely ours, filled with warmth and laughter. I returned to my work in the art world, taking on new projects and reconnecting with old friends. It felt strange, stepping into this new chapter of my life without the weight of Gregory's expectations pressing down on me. But with each passing day, I began to feel more comfortable, more at ease in my own skin. One evening, as Martin and I sat on the balcony, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, he took my hand, his gaze filled with quiet affection. "Elena," he murmured, his voice soft, "are you happy?" I paused, considering his question. Happiness had always felt elusive, a fleeting sensation that I could never quite hold on to. But in that moment, with Martin by my side and the weight of my old life finally lifted, I felt a glimmer of something real, something that felt like the beginning of true happiness. Yes, I replied, my voice filled with quiet certainty. For the first time in a long time, I am. Months passed, and life began to settle into a gentle, comforting rhythm. Martin and I shared a life that was simple yet fulfilling, a world filled with quiet moments and shared dreams. But just as I began to feel truly at peace, a letter arrived that shattered the calm. It was from Gregory, a short, formal note requesting a meeting. My heart raced as I read his words, a mixture of fear and curiosity bubbling within me. After everything that had happened, I couldn't imagine what he wanted, but there was a part of me that couldn't ignore his request, a need for closure that lingered in the back of my mind. When I met him at a small cafe in the city, I was surprised by how much he had changed. He looked tired, worn, his face lined with regret. "Elena," he began, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "I wanted to apologize for everything." His words took me by surprise, a quiet admission that felt both genuine and deeply unsettling. "I don't expect forgiveness," he continued, his gaze fixed on the table. "But I wanted you to know that I never meant to hurt you. I was blinded by my own fears, my own insecurities." I listened in silence, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. It was the apology I had longed for, yet it felt hollow, a reminder of the life we had lost. "Thank you, Gregory," I replied quietly. "I appreciate it, but I've moved on. We both have." He nodded, his gaze distant, as though he were looking back on a life that felt like a distant memory. "I wish you happiness, Elena, truly." And with those words he stood up and walked away, leaving me alone in the quiet cafe, the final chapter of O. He asked me to fix his belt, and before I could even process what was happening, his pants slipped to the floor. In that split second, I saw everything I wasn't supposed to see, and it was like the air left the room entirely. I should have looked away. I knew that. But my hands froze where they were, mid-reach, and my eyes lingered for just a moment too long. Elliot didn't move either. He just stood there, his gaze locked onto mine, as if daring me to acknowledge what had just happened. "Sorry, Cass," he said finally, his voice breaking the tension as he bent down to pull his pants back up. His tone was casual, as if this were some innocent accident, but the smirk that tugged at the corner of his lips told a different story. I tried to laugh it off, shaking my head and muttering something about old belts and clumsy hands, but my cheeks were on fire, and I could barely meet his eyes. The worst part was, I couldn't tell if I was embarrassed for him or for myself. You see, Elliot isn't just some guy who happens to live under the same roof as me. He's my stepson. Well, technically my husband's son from his first marriage. I married Marcus 5 years ago, and Elliot was already off at college by then. We didn't spend much time together in those early years, only the occasional holiday visit or summer weekend. But now, he's home for a while. Something about saving money while finishing his master's degree. I didn't question it much when Marcus suggested it. After all, our house is big enough for the three of us, and it's not like I ever felt uncomfortable around Elliot before. That day, though, something shifted. After the belt incident, as I started calling it in my head, I couldn't stop thinking about him. Not in the maternal, stepmotherly way I knew I was supposed to. No, these thoughts were different. They were wrong. They made me feel things I hadn't felt in years, things I'd all but buried in my stale marriage to Marcus. It didn't help that Elliot seemed to notice the shift too. Or maybe he'd been noticing something about me all along, and I'd just been too blind to see it. The way his eyes lingered a little too long when I walked past in a sundress, the way he found excuses to be near me when Marcus wasn't around, the way he smiled, crooked, boyish, but with an edge that made my stomach tighten in a way it shouldn't. I told myself it was just my imagination, that it was harmless. But deep down, I knew better. Because the truth is, I didn't feel alive again until Elliot looked at me like that. And once you start to feel alive, it's nearly impossible to go back to the dull, lifeless shell you were before. And that moment, in the hallway with his pants on the floor, was only the beginning. That evening, I tried to put the whole thing behind me. I buried myself in work at the antique shop, pricing a new batch of vintage teacups that had come in earlier that day. But my hands were unsteady, and every time I closed my eyes, the image of Elliot standing there, calm, composed, and utterly unapologetic, kept flashing in my mind. By the time I got home, Marcus was already asleep in his usual spot on the couch, a Scotch glass half empty on the side table. The TV was blaring some political debate he'd likely fallen asleep to, and I turned it off, careful not to wake him. Our marriage wasn't unhappy, per se, but it had grown stagnant. We went through the motions, dinners, the occasional weekend trip, but the passion, the spark, was long gone. Maybe that's why what happened with Elliot hit me so hard. It reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten about myself. I made my way upstairs, hoping to slip into bed unnoticed. But as I passed Elliot's room, his door was cracked open, just enough for me to see him sitting on the edge of his bed, scrolling through his phone. He looked up at me, catching my eye before I could pretend I hadn't noticed him. "Hey, Cass," he said softly, his voice low and almost conspiratorial, like we were sharing some kind of secret. "You okay?" I nodded, forcing a tight smile. "Yeah. Just tired." He tilted his head slightly, studying me in that way he had, like he could see straight through me. "You sure? You seem off." "I'm fine," I said, maybe a little too quickly. I started to walk away, but his voice stopped me. "Cass." There it was again, that tone. Not casual, not dismissive, but intimate. It made me pause, my hand hovering on the doorframe. "About earlier," he began, his words trailing off as he stood and crossed the room toward me. I turned to face him, my heart racing. "Elliot, it's fine. Let's just forget it happened, okay?" But he didn't look like he wanted to forget it. He was standing too close now, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating off his skin. His expression was serious, his usual smirk replaced with something more earnest. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I also don't think it was as innocent as you're trying to make it seem." I froze, caught between the urge to deny everything and the overwhelming pull of whatever was happening between us. "Elliot," I started, but I didn't know how to finish the sentence. He stepped closer, so close that his hand brushed against mine. "Tell me I'm wrong," he said. "Tell me you didn't feel it too." I couldn't. I should have, but I couldn't. The silence stretched between us, heavy and charged, until I finally forced myself to step back. "This is wrong," I said, my voice shaking. "You're Marcus's son. This can't happen." But even as I said the words, I knew they sounded hollow. The next few days were tense, to say the least. I avoided being alone with Elliot as much as possible, throwing myself into work and errands to keep myself distracted. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop thinking about him. About the way he'd looked at me, the way his touch had lingered just long enough to send shivers down my spine. And then, one night, everything changed. Marcus was out late at some client dinner, and I was curled up in the den with a glass of wine and an old movie. I thought I was alone until I heard Elliot's footsteps behind me. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, holding up a beer. I hesitated, but there was no real reason to say no. "Sure." He settled onto the couch beside me, closer than he needed to. For a while we just sat there in silence, watching the movie. But I could feel his eyes on me, and the tension between us was impossible to ignore. "You've been avoiding me," he said finally, his voice soft but insistent. "I have not," I lied, keeping my eyes on the screen. He reached over and gently took the wineglass from my hand, setting it on the coffee table. The gesture was so deliberate, so intimate, that it made my breath catch. "Cass," he said, his voice low and steady, "stop pretending this isn't happening." I turned to face him, my heart pounding. "Elliot, But before I could finish, he leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't a tentative, testing kiss, it was confident, almost commanding, and it made my head spin. For a moment, I kissed him back, letting myself get lost in the warmth of his lips, the weight of his hand on my waist. And then reality came crashing back. I pulled away, standing up so quickly I almost knocked over the coffee table. "This is wrong," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We can't do this." He stood too, his expression a mix of frustration and determination. "Why not? Because of Marcus? He doesn't even see you, Cass. He hasn't for years." That doesn't make it okay, I said, my voice cracking. Maybe not, he admitted, stepping closer to me. But it doesn't make it any less real. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to push him away, to tell him he was wrong, but I couldn't, because he wasn't. Before I could stop myself, I closed the distance between us and kissed him again. This time, I didn't pull away. Over the next few weeks, things escalated quickly. At first, we were cautious, careful not to let Marcus or anyone else suspect anything. But the more time we spent together, the harder it became to hide what was happening between us. There was a thrill to it, a sense of danger that only made everything more intoxicating. We stole moments wherever we could, late at night in the den, early mornings in the kitchen, even once in my antique shop when Elliot stopped by under the pretense of helping me move a piece of furniture. But it wasn't just physical. We talked, too, about his plans for the future, about my frustrations with my marriage, about everything and nothing. I started to feel like I could tell him things I'd never been able to tell Marcus, like he saw me in a way no one else ever had. Of course, we knew it couldn't last. Secrets like ours don't stay hidden forever, and the closer we got, the more reckless we became. One night, as we lay tangled together in his bed, Elliot looked at me with a seriousness that sent a chill down my spine. "Cass," he said, his voice soft but firm. "What are we gonna do?" I didn't have an answer. I knew we couldn't keep going like this, but I couldn't imagine walking away either. For the first time in years, I felt alive, and I wasn't ready to let that go. We became careless. Or maybe we just stopped caring about the consequences altogether. The secret we were keeping burned too brightly. It consumed us. What started with stolen kisses in the den turned into whispered rendezvous in every room of the house when Marcus wasn't around. It was thrilling, intoxicating, and absolutely unsustainable. Elliot started visiting my antique shop under the guise of helping out, but we both knew the real reason. The back room, where I kept the overflow inventory, quickly became our sanctuary. I remember one particularly rainy afternoon when he showed up unexpectedly. The shop was empty, save for me dusting off an old mirror with a gilt frame. "Hey," he said, standing in the doorway, his damp hair curling slightly at the edges. He looked too casual for someone just stopping by, jeans that clung to him a little too well, a white t-shirt that hinted at the toned body beneath. I sighed, setting down the rag. "Elliot, you can't just show up here like this." "Why not?" he grinned, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "No one's here." "That's not the point," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew they carried no weight. Because the truth was, I wanted him there. I wanted him everywhere. Before I could say anything else, he crossed the room in 3 quick strides, cupping my face in his hands and kissing me like he'd been waiting for this moment all day. I melted into him, my hands gripping his shirt as he backed me against the wall. The guilt that had been gnawing at me earlier evaporated, replaced by a heat that made me forget where we were. Or what we were doing. When we finally broke apart, breathless, I pressed my forehead to his and whispered, "You're going to ruin me." He smiled, that cocky, boyish grin I'd come to both love and hate. "Maybe you want to be ruined." Our recklessness didn't go unnoticed for long. Linda, my best friend and the only person who'd stood by me through the ups and downs of my marriage to Marcus, started to piece things together. She didn't confront me directly at first, but her knowing glances and pointed questions during our coffee dates were impossible to ignore. "You've been glowing lately," she remarked one morning, her tone laced with suspicion. "Something you want to share?" I laughed it off, shaking my head. "Glowing? Please. It's probably just the new moisturizer I've been using." "Uh-huh." She leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. "Or maybe it's something, or someone else?" My stomach flipped. Linda was sharp, and if anyone could figure out what was going on, it was her. I deflected as best I could, changing the subject to a new client at the shop, but her gaze lingered on me for just a moment too long. I knew I was playing a dangerous game, but I couldn't stop. Elliot was like a drug, and I was too far gone to quit cold turkey. Then there was Marcus. For someone so preoccupied with his work, he started noticing things he hadn't before. My sudden penchant for late-night inventory checks at the shop, Elliot's constant presence around the house, the way I seemed lighter, happier when he was out of town. One night, over dinner, Marcus casually mentioned that he'd run into Linda at the grocery store. "She said you've been spending a lot of time at the shop lately," he said, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp. I froze, my fork hovering midair. "Well, it's been busy. You know how it is." He took a sip of his wine, his gaze never leaving mine. "You should take a break. You've been working too hard." I nodded, forcing a smile. "Maybe." The conversation moved on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus was watching me more closely than usual. And then, a few days later, I found out why. It started with a text from Elliot. "We need to talk." I frowned at my phone, the pit in my stomach growing. We rarely communicated via text. It was too risky, so for him to reach out like this meant something was wrong. I told him to meet me at the shop after closing. When he arrived, he looked uncharacteristically serious, his usual smirk replaced by a furrowed brow. "What's going on?" I asked, locking the door behind him. He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "I think Marcus is on to us." My heart stopped. "What do you mean?" "I saw a guy parked down the street from the house the other day. He had a camera, Cass. He was taking pictures." "Pictures of what?" "Of us." His voice was tight, his jaw clenched. "He followed me to campus yesterday, too." I sank into the nearest chair, my head spinning. Oh my God, Marcus hired a private investigator. Elliot crouched in front of me, his hands gripping my knees. "We need to figure out what to do, Cass. If he finds out, he'll destroy us," I finished, my voice barely above a whisper. We sat there in silence, the weight of our situation pressing down on us. For the first time, I felt the full gravity of what we'd done. Not just the betrayal, but the very real consequences we were about to face. But the PI wasn't the only problem. A few days later, while I was going through some old files in Marcus's office, I stumbled across something I wasn't supposed to see. Documents linking Marcus to several offshore accounts and questionable business deals. At first, I didn't know what to make of it, but the more I read, the more it became clear. Marcus wasn't just a successful attorney. He was laundering money for his high-profile clients. The realization hit me like a freight train. If Marcus found out about me and Elliot, he wouldn't just divorce me or ruin Elliot's career. He'd use his connections to destroy us both. And now, I had the proof that could ruin him too. When I told Elliot what I'd found, he was furious. "We have to do something," he said, pacing back and forth in my living room. "We can't just sit back and let him control us." "And what exactly do you suggest?" I snapped. "If we go to the police, we'll have to explain how we found out. Do you really want them digging into our lives?" He stopped pacing, his hands on his hips. "So what? We just let him win?" "No," I said firmly. "We use this to our advantage." Over the next few days, I came up with a plan. A risky, desperate plan that could either save us or destroy us completely. I enlisted Linda's help, reluctantly telling her part of the truth. She was shocked, of course, but to my surprise, she agreed to help. "This is insane," she said as we finalized the details. "But if anyone can pull it off, it's you." The plan was simple in theory, but complicated in execution. I leaked just enough information about Marcus's illegal activities to his biggest client, an ambitious politician with everything to lose. The goal was to force Marcus into damage control, distracting him long enough for Elliot and me to make our next move. But things didn't go exactly as planned. Marcus confronted me one night, his face red with anger. "Do you think I'm stupid, Cassandra?" He spat, slamming a folder onto the dining table. It was filled with photos, me and Elliot in the shop, in the den, even in his bedroom. The PI had been thorough. "Marcus, Don't," he said, his voice cold. "Don't insult me by denying it." I braced myself for the inevitable explosion, but instead, Marcus did something I didn't expect. He smiled, a cruel, calculating smile that sent a chill down my spine. "You think you've won," he said, "but I'm not the one who's going to lose everything." As Marcus's world began to crumble under the weight of his scandals, he turned his focus entirely on me and Elliot. He tried to sabotage Elliot's academic career, using his connections to get him blacklisted from internships and potential job offers. He even threatened to release the photos to the media, knowing the scandal would ruin both of us. But he underestimated me. With Linda's help, I gathered enough evidence to expose Marcus's crimes to the authorities. It was a risky move, but it was our only chance. The night before the FBI raided his office, I confronted him one last time. You brought this on yourself, I said, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. He laughed bitterly. You think this makes you the winner? You'll never escape what you've done, Cassandra. Neither of you will. When it was all over, I felt a strange mix of relief and emptiness. Marcus was gone, facing federal charges that would likely put him away for years. Elliot and I were free, but at what cost? As we stood together in the wreckage of our lives, Elliot took my hand and said, "What now?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that everything had changed, and there was no going back. In the days following Marcus's arrest, the house felt eerily quiet. His presence had been such a looming, oppressive force that, without him, everything seemed strangely hollow. Elliot and I were free, or at least as free as two people bound by a web of lies and destruction could be. But freedom didn't bring peace. It brought questions, doubts, and a nagging sense of guilt that neither of us could shake. Elliot had been my constant during Marcus's unraveling, but now that the storm had passed, we found ourselves standing in the wreckage with no clear idea of what came next. One evening, about a week after the FBI raid, we sat together in the den, the same den where our affair had truly begun. The irony wasn't lost on me. Elliot was nursing a beer, his legs stretched out on the ottoman, while I sipped a glass of wine, staring blankly at the TV. Neither of us was watching it. "I've been thinking," Elliot said suddenly, breaking the silence. "About what?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. "About us." He turned to look at me, his blue eyes serious. "What do we do now, Cass? Where do we go from here?" I set my glass down, pressing my palms into my lap. I'd been asking myself the same question for days. "I don't know," I admitted. "We've burned every bridge we had. Marcus is out of the picture, but that doesn't erase everything that's happened." He frowned, his jaw tightening. "Do you regret it?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to say no, to reassure him that everything we'd done had been worth it. But the truth was more complicated than that. "I don't regret you," I said finally, meeting his gaze. "But I regret the way we did this. The lies, the secrets, the people we hurt." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, I get that." We sat in silence for a while, the weight of our choices hanging heavy between us. The next day, Linda showed up unannounced at the shop. She'd been my rock through everything, even when she didn't fully understand the depth of my relationship with Elliot. "Marcus is going to fight this," she said, as she sat across from me in the back office. "You know that, right? Men like him don't go down without a fight." I sighed, leaning back in my chair. "I know, but I don't think he has much left to fight with. The FBI has enough evidence to bury him." "That's not what I mean," she said, her tone pointed. "He might be out of the picture legally, but he'll find a way to make your life hell, and Elliot's." I knew she was right. Marcus was vindictive, and even from behind bars, he'd find a way to exert control. "What do you suggest I do?" I asked, frustration creeping into my voice. Linda hesitated, her brow furrowing. "You need to figure out what you want, Cass. Not just with Elliot, but for yourself, because all of this, it's going to follow you wherever you go." That night, Elliot and I had another conversation, one that neither of us wanted to have, but both knew was inevitable. "I've been thinking about leaving," he said quietly as we lay in bed together. "Leaving?" I turned to face him, my chest tightening. "Why?" "Because I need to figure out who I am outside of this." He gestured vaguely between us. "Outside of you and Marcus and everything that's happened. I love you, Cass, I do. But I can't keep living in this bubble we've created. It's not real." His words cut deeper than I expected. I'd always known deep down that our relationship wasn't sustainable, but hearing him say it out loud felt like losing him all over again. "So what are you saying?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I'm saying I need space," he said, his eyes filled with sadness. "I need to go somewhere, start over, figure out what my life looks like without all this baggage." I nodded, even though it felt like my heart was breaking. "I understand." The day Elliot left, the house felt emptier than ever. He packed up his car with a few bags and kissed me goodbye in the driveway, his lips lingering on mine as if he didn't want to let go. "I'll call you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I nodded, blinking back tears. "Take care of yourself, Elliot." And then he was gone. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into my work. The shop became my refuge. A place where I could lose myself in the mundane tasks of cataloging inventory and helping customers. Linda checked in on me regularly, her concern evident but unspoken. Marcus's trial began shortly after Elliot left, and while I was called as a witness, I kept my testimony strictly professional. I avoided eye contact with him in the courtroom, focusing instead on the questions from the prosecutor. When the verdict came down, guilty on all counts, I felt a sense of relief, but also an overwhelming sadness. Marcus had been a terrible husband, but he hadn't always been a terrible man. There was a time, years ago, when I'd loved him. That man was long gone, swallowed by greed and ambition. Months passed, and life slowly started to settle into something resembling normalcy. I heard from Elliot occasionally, short texts or emails letting me know he was okay. He'd moved to a new city, started a new job, and seemed to be doing well. I missed him every day, but I knew his absence was necessary. We both needed time to heal, to rebuild our lives on our own terms. One afternoon, as I was closing up the shop, I found a package on the counter. There was no return address, but I recognized the handwriting instantly. Inside was a small, hand-carved wooden box with a note tucked inside. "Cass, I saw this at a market and thought of you." It reminded me of the antique shop, of all the times we spent there together. "I hope you're doing well. I miss you. Love, Elliot." I ran my fingers over the smooth surface of the box, tears welling in my eyes. It was a simple gesture, but it meant everything. For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe our story wasn't over after all. Maybe someday we'd find our way back to each other. But for now, I had to focus on rebuilding my life. One day, one choice, one moment at a time. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could. Months turned into a year, and while life slowly found its rhythm again, I couldn't shake the lingering ache of Elliot's absence. The house, once filled with whispers and stolen moments, now echoed with silence. I immersed myself in the shop more than ever, letting it become the cornerstone of my new life. Marcus's conviction had left me with some financial freedom. The house was officially mine after the divorce was finalized, and while I thought about selling it, I couldn't bring myself to leave. It wasn't the memories of Marcus that kept me tethered. It was Elliot. His laughter in the kitchen, his voice in the den, the way he used to lean against the counter while I made coffee. Every room still carried his presence, and maybe, in some masochistic way, I wasn't ready to let go. One afternoon, as I was rearranging a new display in the shop, Linda walked in with a newspaper tucked under her arm. Her expression was unreadable, and the moment she set the paper on the counter, I knew something was wrong. "Have you seen this?" she asked, sliding the paper toward me. The headline jumped out immediately. "Convicted attorney alleges corruption in high-profile cases." Below it was a picture of Marcus, his face gaunt, and his eyes burning with the same fury I'd seen in the courtroom. My stomach twisted as I scanned the article. Marcus was claiming that his conviction had been part of a larger conspiracy within the justice system. He wasn't just pointing fingers at his former clients, he was naming names, including mine. "He's accusing you of being involved," Linda said, her voice low but urgent. I stared at the words, my hands trembling. Marcus had told the reporter that I'd played a key role in his downfall, framing me as an accomplice who'd betrayed him to save herself. "This is insane," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Linda nodded. "Of course it is. But Marcus is smart, Cass. He knows how to manipulate people, and he's playing the long game here. You need to be careful." The thought of Marcus trying to pull me back into his toxic orbit made my skin crawl. I'd finally begun to rebuild my life, and now he was trying to tear it all apart again. The fallout from the article was immediate. Customers started canceling orders, and a few even stopped coming to the shop altogether. Whispers followed me everywhere I went, and I could feel the judgment in every glance from the townspeople who'd once supported me. Then, the letters started. At first, I thought they were harmless, a disgruntled Marcus supporter or some anonymous troll. But as they became more frequent, I realized they were far too personal to be random. They mentioned details only Marcus would know. The antique chair in my office, the way Elliot used to visit the shop, even the scar on my wrist from when I'd cut myself on a broken mirror years ago. I took the letters to Linda, who stared at them with a mix of disbelief and anger. "This is harassment, Cass. You need to go to the police. But I hesitated. What could I tell them? That my ex-husband, currently serving a prison sentence, was somehow orchestrating a campaign of terror from behind bars? It sounded paranoid, even to me. One evening, as I was locking up the shop, I noticed a man lingering across the street. He was tall, with a hood pulled over his head, and while he didn't do anything overtly threatening, his presence unnerved me. I hurried to my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. When I got home, I checked every lock twice and closed the blinds in every room. The house felt bigger, emptier than ever. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in the living room, staring at my phone. For the first time in months, I thought about calling Elliot. I'd told myself I wouldn't. He deserved the chance to build his life without me dragging him back into the mess I'd created. But as the fear clawed at me, I couldn't help but wonder if he could make me feel safe again. If only for a moment. The decision was made for me the next morning when my phone buzzed with an incoming call. I didn't recognize the number, but something told me to answer. Cass, Elliot's voice came through the line, warm and familiar. My heart leapt and then immediately sank, knowing I couldn't let him back into this chaos. Elliot, I said softly, clutching the phone. It's been a while. Yeah, I know, he said, his tone hesitant. I saw the article about Marcus, and then I heard about the letters. Who told you? I asked, my stomach flipping. Linda called me, he admitted. She thought I should know. I made a mental note to scold Linda later, but I couldn't focus on that now. Elliot, it's fine. I'm handling it. It's not fine, he said sharply. You shouldn't have to deal with this alone. Elliot, I'm coming back, he interrupted, his voice firm. I don't care what you say, you need me, and I'm not letting Marcus ruin your life again. Before I could protest, he hung up. I stared at the phone, equal parts relieved and terrified. Having Elliot back in my life felt like a lifeline. But I knew it would only complicate things further. When he arrived 2 days later, it was as if no time had passed. He walked into the shop like he belonged there, his presence instantly grounding me. I wanted to tell him he shouldn't have come, but the words died on my lips when he pulled me into a hug, his arms strong and steady around me. I missed you, he said quietly, his breath warm against my ear. I missed you too, I admitted, my voice cracking. We spent the evening catching up, and for a brief moment it felt like everything might be okay. But reality came crashing back the next morning, when I found another letter taped to the front door of the shop. This one was different. It wasn't a vague threat or an insinuation. It was a direct message. You'll never escape me, Cassandra. Not while I'm alive. I showed it to Elliot, my hands trembling. His expression darkened as he read it, and I could see the fury simmering beneath the surface. This ends now, he said, his voice low and dangerous. How? I asked, feeling helpless. He didn't answer right away, but I could see the gears turning in his mind. Leave it to me, he said finally. I'll handle it. In the days that followed, Elliot became my shadow, refusing to let me out of his sight. I should have felt smothered, but instead, I felt safer than I had in months. He even started staying at the house again, and while we tried to keep things platonic, the tension between us was impossible to ignore. One night, as we sat on the back porch watching the stars, he turned to me and said, I don't care what happens, Cass. I'm not leaving you again. I wanted to believe him, to trust that we could build a future together despite everything that had happened. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Marcus's reach was long, and as much as I wanted to believe we'd won, I couldn't shake the feeling that he still had one final move to play. And when it came, I knew it would change everything. Again.